Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this fourth talk of today and our first keynote of the second day of the Sonic Ecology Conference. I have a great honor and privilege to welcome Dr. Leah Barclay, who, hello Leah, welcome digitally from here at the Asia Society here in Hong Kong. So Leah is a sound artist, designer, and researcher who works at the intersection of art, science, and technology. And her research and creative work over the last decade has investigated innovative approaches to recording and disseminating the soundscapes of terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. I had the great honor of working with Leah, I think around 10 to 12 years ago here in Hong Kong, where she worked on a wonderful piece called Liquid Borders, and this is our first real meeting since. And so I'm really interested to find out more about the work you've been doing since we last met, and how you've been listening to ecosystems. So welcome, Leah. I'm very it's our great honor to have you here.
Thank you so much, William. It's a great honor to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation to give a keynote for this conference. So I am going to speak quite broadly about my practice and three major projects that are very interdisciplinary in nature. And I'm just going to share some slides. Just give me 1 second to get this rolling. So you should be able to see my slides now. That's all good? Yep, excellent. So the title of this talk is Listening to Ecosystems from Interdisciplinary Perspectives. And I do want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land for which I'm speaking today, the Gubbi Gubbi people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We're looking at an image from Gubbi Gubbi country here on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia, where I am. And this is the Maroochy River and one of the locations which I'll actually be speaking about in the talk today. So my practice is all very much grounded in environmental field recording, looking at ways that we can listen to ecosystems from interdisciplinary perspectives. So for both the purpose of artistic projects and collaborations and scientific monitoring and scientific research. So really what we can learn from listening to the environment in an interdisciplinary way. And I'm really passionate about how we can engage communities in that process. So my practice overall has had a really strong community engagement focus. And as an artist, I'm really interested in creating immersive environments. So the majority of my creative practice revolves around large-scale immersive performances in full surround sound with drawing on the environmental field recordings from different locations. This can also include immersive installations with live streaming audio, working with different ecosystems across the planet that may go for 24 hours or 48 hours, to also site-specific venues, so actually building custom venues for particular projects. This example we're looking at here is a geodesic dome on Mooloolaba Beach on the Sunshine Coast for a project called Listening Underwater. And this was live streaming the soundscapes of aquatic ecosystems, but also mixing live in full surround sound my large database of hydrophone recordings as well into this immersive performance. So just a couple of examples of the performance and installation based work that I do. And then I've also had a really strong focus on creating mobile experiences, so mobile applications, but particularly augmented reality sound walks, where we can actually geolocate soundscapes in natural environments and urban environments as well, and really bring the communities to those ecosystems through these immersive experiences. So sound walks where these soundscapes are geolocated along the riverbank, for example, and you can basically trigger the sounds by walking past them. So I'm going to speak about that today in the context of a project called River Listening as well. As an example of one of the geolocated soundscapes, this was a project for Climate Week in New York City in 2015, where we mapped the soundscapes of the Central Amazon Biosphere Reserve across Times Square in New York. So juxtapose this intense and chaotic soundscape of New York City with the sounds of the Amazon rainforest. And this was designed to really bring the environments that were being spoken about at this conference, major decisions being made about the future of the Amazon rainforest. So really bring those soundscapes to the location where they were being spoken about. Likewise, we took a very similar approach for COP21 in Paris, taking these soundscapes from the Central Amazon rainforest and sounds that I had recorded several years before at different heights in the rainforest. So looking at mapping the soundscapes of 4 different layers of tropical rainforest vegetation from forest floor to canopy. And for COP21, we mapped these soundscapes over the Eiffel Tower. So again, this was about bringing these ecosystems that were being discussed at this event to the ears of decision makers. So looking at the way that sound could really be part of the conversation. And so that's just some examples, I guess, a snapshot of my creative practice before I dive into the interdisciplinary possibilities of some of these projects. So for me, all of my work and research over the last decade has really been underpinned by some of my very early research in my PhD. And through my PhD, I developed a framework called Sonic Ecologies, which I thought was a perfect opportunity to reflect on it in the context of this conference. And what I guess we're looking at on the screen here is a very simplified version of that framework. And I just wanted to give you a sense of what each of these elements really mean to my practice now, because even though this was kind of conceived about a decade ago, these ideas still really underpin everything I do. So this initial premise of a creative project that absolutely must have site-specific research and development. So not composing a piece of music inspired by an ecosystem that I hadn't visited or didn't understand, but actually immersing myself in that environment and having a deep scientific understanding of that ecosystem as well. Likewise, it's been essential for my practice to be embedded in communities. So developing these collaborative and long-term strategies and responding to the interests of the community and what the community actually wants to do as part of these projects, which is very interconnected to this idea of interdisciplinary collaborations and projects, working with local conservation organisations, working with regional and state governments, working with obviously local arts and cultural organisations as well, but looking at developing these long-term interdisciplinary and collaborations and partnerships around projects, and never just focusing on one outcome, but multiple creative works and publications that can draw a wider attention and awareness to the long-term research that really underpins these creative projects that I've been working on. And obviously, all of these projects are really about drawing attention and awareness to what's happening in these ecosystems across the planet, this urgent need to listen. So it was initially really this idea of a creative project that was embedded in an environment and a community that could facilitate different education pathways, partnerships, and ultimately influence policy in some ways. And all of this research is fundamentally, for me, underpinned by environmental field recording. So recording these different ecosystems, and, you know, when this started with a much stronger artistic focus, all of these recordings were forming the foundation for the initial creative projects. And the more I have worked in environmental field recording, the more I've got involved in those interdisciplinary possibilities, looking at how these sounds can be a measure for environmental health. You know, as an example, if we look at this image of the canopy of the Amazon rainforest, it tells us very little information about the health of that environment. We can't really see what species are living in this ecosystem. We don't know how healthy it is. We don't know the specific species of birds or insects that might be there. But if we had an acoustic recorder at this location, suddenly we get a deep sense of the spatial and temporal complexities of this environment and what species actually live there. We're able to use these acoustic recordings now to truly monitor biodiversity. These acoustic recorders can run for months and years on end remotely in different locations across the planet and be capturing large amounts of acoustic data that we can use to monitor these ecosystems in a really non-invasive way. And this technology is developing at such a rapid pace now that we have these incredible devices like the Audio Moth, which is under $50 Australian, that it's now realistic and possible to really put these devices in the hands of communities across the planet to be mapping changing environments. And a device like this can run on just 3 AA batteries with a micro SD card and be recording for months in the field. So it's a really interesting time for this field of acoustics, despite the environmental crisis that we're in at the moment. And I've always been very interested by these interdisciplinary possibilities. But what's interesting with this rapid scientific advancement is listening is not always part of the process. And so I'm really interested in this idea of acoustic ecology as the, I guess, umbrella field that's bringing together these artistic and scientific perspectives around listening. So acoustic ecology, can be defined as really understanding the social, cultural, and ecological context of our environment through sound. Really looking at everything from bioacoustics, soundscape ecology, and ecoacoustics to those very early foundations of acoustic ecology, R. Murray Schafer's initial premise that we should, listen to the acoustic environment as if it's music and really own responsibility for its composition. To these ideas of, deep listening and Steve Feld's acoustomology, sound as a really distinctive medium for knowing the world. Now, there's obviously tension in some of these ideas, which I'm going to talk more about in the workshop later as well when we're looking at approaches to recording. But these tensions around listening, when we're looking at some of the more scientific perspectives, it's often about actually removing listening from the process, whereas the more humanities and artistic perspectives is really about privileging listening and listening as a tool to connect us to the environment. So all of the research I'm engaged with is really about combining these ideas, bringing artists and scientists together in interdisciplinary contexts to really focus on listening and what we can learn from listening from these different perspectives. So these are the 3 major projects that I'm currently leading that have been evolving and emerging for the last few years. And I'm going to touch on elements of each of these briefly today. So BIOSPHERE Soundscapes is working in collaboration with UNESCO, and it's really about mapping the changing soundscapes of UNESCO biosphere reserves, looking at how we can use sound as a measure for environmental health in UNESCO biosphere reserves. We've got a whole range of elements to this project that have had to change pretty dramatically this year with the impacts of COVID. We haven't been running residencies lately, but usually we would run residencies with artists and scientists and local community groups, a whole range of creative outcomes that come out of these residencies, masterclasses, labs, and short courses, which are shifting all online at the moment, and large-scale biodiversity monitoring with sound, which is all contributing into a global sound map, which is relaunching next year in collaboration with UNESCO. And this all feeds into a whole range of intentions around really policy change in UNESCO biosphere reserves, but also the idea of really using sound as a catalyst to inspire other environments to actually apply to become a biosphere reserve. Now, this wasn't an intention of the project initially. It was an accidental outcome in the first couple of instances, but it's been really exciting to see how many of the creative outcomes have actually inspired other locations to look at the pathways to actually become a UNESCO recognized biosphere reserve. And we now have hundreds of biosphere reserves across the planet, which UNESCO really defines as this idea of learning laboratories for sustainability, these interdisciplinary laboratories. And one of the main focus of our project in the last few years has been setting up this Biosphere Open Microphone Network. So this idea of live streaming the soundscapes of biosphere reserves in real time, where those live streams can be used for both artistic projects and scientific monitoring. We've had a range of pilot locations since 2017 that you can see listed there. And we're now shifting into a phase of launching some permanent live stream locations through this biome project in the next 5 years. So this is very much one of the major outcomes and major focus areas of Biosphere Soundscapes at the moment. And we're working in collaboration with a whole range of organisations to make this happen, particularly SoundCamp in the UK. And as an example of a creative outcome of this, SoundCamp led a project called Reveille, and they've been leading this for 5 years now. And it was particularly interesting this year. I was privileged to play a major role in actually mixing for the Asia Pacific region, but this was essentially a live 24-hour broadcast following the soundscapes of dawn around the entire planet. So this idea of live streaming microphone to microphone as the sun's rising, listening to these rich and dynamic soundscapes and basically streaming these soundscapes of dawn for 24 hours continuously. Now, it was quite a unique moment in time to be listening. There were hundreds of microphones across the planet, many partners and collaborators involved in actually delivering a project of this scale and scope. But of course, you know, in May this year, it was quite a profound moment to be listening. This was a point in time where much of the world was in total lockdown with the impacts of COVID. So a unique soundscape where there was a significant reduction in anthropogenic noise, less boats in the ocean, in the hydrophone live streams, less planes in the air, less cars on the road. So this unique and quite profound moment to listen to our planet in a way that we hadn't been able to for many years. Yet there was also this distinctive sonic tension in many of the streams. So this idea of live streaming is a big part of Biosphere Soundscapes, but of course the sound recordings themselves are primarily used for artistic purposes and biodiversity monitoring. So naturally this can be species specific, looking at monitoring individual species, but we also have had a very strong focus on really pushing the boundaries of what's possible with acoustic technology in the environment, listening in an infrasonic and an ultrasonic range, so above and below our hearing, and really exploring and collaborating with some of the latest acoustics research that's happening at the moment. Understanding these really incredible discoveries that are being made literally every couple of weeks at the moment in the acoustic space. As an example, you know, we do a lot of ultrasonic monitoring with different species of bats or microbats. And, you know, bats will use ultrasonics to actually hunt moths, for example. So using a ping, an ultrasonic ping, they're basically emitting that sound and it allows them to see the moth while they're hunting. And, you know, we've now have all of this incredible research demonstrating how these moths, multiple species of moths, have actually evolved to develop this acoustic camouflage, so protecting themselves from these ultrasonic sounds. So just one example of some of the really interesting discoveries that are being made in sound at the moment. Likewise, one of my major collaborators at the moment, Monica Gagliano, has been pioneering the field of plant bioacoustics for many years, now one of the world's leaders in this field, and, you know, has really demonstrated how plants use sound to communicate and survive in some instances. And so this idea of really understanding the acoustic ecology of biosphere reserves and of the environment in general from a holistic perspective, it's essential for us to understand everything that's making sound in the environment. So the sound of plants is a big part of this research at the moment as well. And this can come down to, you know, a very simple and micro example looking at the way that spiders actually use webs to emit sound and the acoustic properties of a spider web in itself. So there's a whole range of really exciting interdisciplinary possibilities with the work that we're doing in terrestrial environments with biosphere soundscapes. But of course, a really big focus of my research is in aquatic environments, marine and freshwater environments. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with the sounds of the humpback whale, for example, and perhaps you're also quite familiar with the sounds of dolphins. But if we look at an environment like this, a freshwater lake, you might be less familiar with what sounds may be beneath the surface. And we're often sort of thinking of an environment like this as a peaceful and quiet ecosystem, and that might be correct above the surface. If we're sitting by this lake, we might not be able to hear a whole lot of sonic diversity. But it's really fascinating once we drop these hydrophones, these underwater microphones beneath the surface, suddenly we have access to this incredible acoustic diversity. And it's often a remarkable soundscape of rhythmic clicking and popping and interaction just beneath the surface. So hydrophones, underwater microphones have become a really key tool in my practice for over a decade now. I've been really passionate about recording rivers. And in my really early work in this space, you know, I was creating installations and performances that were designed to draw attention to rivers as the lifeblood of communities. And I was always really fascinated when I put my hydrophones beneath the surface, just how diverse these soundscapes were, how different a really polluted river in North India would sound in comparison to a river flowing through a city like Chicago here, a frozen river in this example. And I was always enthralled by these sounds. And at this point in time, you know, many of the sounds that I didn't really know exactly what they were. I could identify some fish and different insects, but a whole range of sounds that I didn't really know what I was recording. And, you know, this example here, project on the Narmada River in North India in 2010 to 2012, I was recording this river system. And, you know, this is a river that has been dammed and is highly polluted. And I was struck by the silence of this river and really drawn to the idea of how powerful sound was as an indicator of, you know, the health and the voice of this river system. And it was this project and other projects at the time that really inspired me to dive deeper into the scientific possibilities of recording aquatic ecosystems, particularly rivers. And I mean, if we look at the surface of a river system, it's virtually impossible to tell what's happening. You know, these impacts of climate change are often very visible in terrestrial environments. We can see the changes visibly in the trees. If there's a dramatic weather event, that's immediately visible. And likewise, you know, we can hear changes. If there's a major loss in biodiversity, species of birds or bats disappearing, we can hear those changes. Yet these dramatic changes in freshwater ecosystems are often going unnoticed simply due to visibility. And that really struck me as something that, I thought sound could be such a powerful tool to give us access to what's happening beneath the surface. And so as I dive deeper into the science, many of the techniques that are used to monitor biodiversity, particularly at the time, are very invasive and don't necessarily give us accurate information about the health of the environment. Dr. Simon Linke, for example, one of my main collaborators, he talks about this idea of the classic methods not reflecting reality. So capture and release and electrofishing, for example, not giving us an accurate picture of what's actually happening in that ecosystem, and often isn't very cost effective either. And so this, species that we're trying to monitor to indicate biodiversity, we're often looking at the presence or absence of particular species of fish and aquatic insects, many of which make sound. So it seems like quite an obvious pathway to actually monitor these species through the sounds that they're making. Just as an example, this is a black drumfish, which was actually a marine fish. This is a spangled perch. This is a catfish in the Brisbane River in Queensland. And then these are a whole range of aquatic insects as well. Now, we're obviously looking at this from a bioacoustics perspective right now, so single species identification, but I've been equally passionate at looking and exploring rivers through their soundscapes from an ecoacoustic perspective. So I just want to give you an example of a few different river systems that have really focused through this research to allow you to understand them from an ecoacoustics perspective. I'm going to stop those examples there because I'm going to come back to some of those examples in the workshop later today as well. But I hope that gives you a sense of this very distinctive and an individual voice of these river systems, a voice that changes pretty dramatically throughout the day as well. You know, a very different soundscape at dawn to dusk, through the day and throughout the night. So it seemed really obvious that we could use these hydrophones, underwater microphones, to monitor the health of river systems, both in identifying individual species, but capture rivers from a holistic sound perspective as well. And, you know, what's been really exciting in the last 5 to 10 years is the accessibility and the quality of this technology has improved dramatically. So hydrophones are getting more and more affordable and better quality, and enable us to really get these into different river systems across the planet with a lot more ease than there was in the past. You know, as an example, a marine grade hydrophone, you know, quite a complex installation process that requires a boat, scuba divers, and quite a significant budget to get something like this installed. But now we're at the point where we can capture the same quality of acoustic data with a Raspberry Pi, a small microcomputer that we can literally fit in the palms of our hands. So it's quite an exciting time to look at the accessibility of this technology. And that really is what underpins the River Listening Project, which has been about exploring the cultural and biological diversity of river systems through sound, and really exploring ways that we can get communities involved in this process, both from the perspective of drawing a wider attention and awareness to the value of river systems and the importance of freshwater conservation, but also in drawing communities into creating these live sound maps and databases that enable us to monitor rivers. We've been really lucky to work with rivers in different parts of the world and, you know, really build different ways to engage with communities into that process. As an example, this is Marilyn O'Connell on the Mary River in Queensland, who's become a big part of working with the River Listening Project on the Mary River, everything from helping us find field locations to extending different elements of the project into monitoring Mary River turtles. And this is the Noosa River in Queensland. And it was interesting in the early stages of this research, you know, one of the environmental managers in the area here was saying, well, it's sort of all well and good to create these performances and music compositions that are inspired by the river system and designed to bring attention and awareness to the river system. But if we're saying that these can be tools for conservation, then, you know, show us some peer-reviewed scientific research that's sort of saying that fish are talking to each other and we can use that to monitor the health of the environment, then that will put this in the right direction. And this was said in quite a joking way at the time, but it was definitely a catalyst to invest more in those scientific possibilities of listening. And I've been really privileged to work with some incredible scientists who are now world leaders in this field of freshwater ecoacoustics. So really using sound as a tool to monitor the health of river systems. This idea of freshwater ecoacoustics is now becoming an appropriate and a somewhat respected technique in the field. And likewise, you know, we've been really focused on publishing on the interdisciplinary approaches to this. So publishing in scientific journals about how the artistic approaches to field recording have become really critical in helping us advance the scientific methods. Likewise, this has been about engaging communities directly in the process, making this as accessible as possible for young people to really engage. And as I mentioned earlier, the possibilities of live streaming these river systems, generating these large databases of acoustic recordings have, of course, been really complicated. But we've been working with some incredible scientists to look at techniques that enable us to really understand these large amounts of acoustic data. As an example, Michael Towsey, a Queensland-based scientist, has developed a technique called false color spectrograms, which enables us to really analyze large amounts of acoustic data visually. And I love to use this image as it's such a powerful example of how we can really analyze such a large quantity of acoustic data that becomes quite visually beautiful as well. What we're looking at here is a false color spectrogram, what we would call a ribbon plot spectrogram, so ribbons of sound. We're looking at 44 days of continuous acoustic data. So we have here 44 ribbons, which are all stacked on top of each other there, and that each represents a continuous 24-hour recording. These are hydrophone recordings off the coast of Georgia. in Atlanta. And this is a location which was thought to not have much acoustic impact from passing ship traffic. This is a breeding zone for North Atlantic right whales. And so it was said it's, you know, there's not an impact of the ship sounds in this area, so there doesn't have to be any changes made. But what we're looking at visually here is every time you can see a red bump in these recordings, that's actually a passing ship. And so you can see there's points there where you would be able to hear that ship for 2 or 3 hours at a time. So just by looking at this snapshot of acoustic data, we're revealing that acoustic environment that these whales are living in and breeding in. And what I find really powerful about this example as well is it's really accessible. And we've used this in the context of different interdisciplinary collaborations, using it as a score for installations and performances, but also, you know, using it in the context of community engagement. And, you know, I find using it in workshops, children really understand what's happening in this environment and understand that, you know, this would be quite a complex acoustic environment for whales to be breeding in. So I'm just going to move through this last section quite quickly in the interest of time. So for me, this all comes back to ways that these sounds can be a tool to really immerse communities in these environments as well. As a composer and sound artist, you know, I'm really inspired by bringing these sounds back to the communities, allowing people to connect to the sounds beneath the surface of river systems, and finding ways to really bring people to different parts of the environment they might not traditionally visit. You know, as an example, for the Listening Underwater project, for the augmented reality soundscapes, we actually updated them daily. So these sounds that actually moved with the tides. So you actually had to take your shoes off and put your feet in the water to be able to access these geolocated soundscapes that were planted along the coastline. And some of the more recent examples has been looking at ways that we can really bring communities to these environments and create the same experience as an immersive live performance, but mix it all in a site-specific way. So this example for Horizon Festival last year, I had live hydrophones in the water, live microphones in different ecosystems, and I mixed it all live as the community actually walked along the riverbank. And this is Brent Miller, Gubbi Gubbi traditional custodian, who did a welcome to country and was playing didgeridoo into the water through the hydrophones. And so as the community was walking along throughout the environment and along the riverbank, all of these sounds were being mixed into this live performance, this deep listening experience. And I found this was a really powerful way to connect communities to the soundscapes that were beneath their feet, soundscapes that were always there that they hadn't necessarily thought about as well. And just to finish off with, you know, a most recent example was a project called Listening in the Wild for Horizon Festival this year. This was done in collaboration with Gubbi Gubbi songman Lyndon Davis, traditional custodian of Gubbi Gubbi country, and documentary photographer Trisha King. And this project was about creating a live immersive experience of 3 different ecosystems across the Sunshine Coast, but streaming it live and allowing people to access it from their homes. This was a time where the whole festival, much like the festival we're engaged with right now, had to move online due to the impacts of COVID. So looking at ways that we could bring these ecosystems into people's homes. So we had 3 particular environments we worked with: the Marucci River, and Lyndon played didgeridoo into the surface of the river system. You can see the hydrophone there that was capturing the soundscapes of the river, and the didgeridoo was reverberating through that riverbed. And Lyndon also told stories on the banks of the river, which were recorded with binaural microphones that allowed you to feel like you were sitting beside him on the riverbed. And These soundscapes are all available online. I won't play them for you right now, but I'd encourage you to have a listen afterwards if you're interested. And so Trish's images were presented there as a portfolio, so you could engage with these soundscapes visually before the live streams and the deep listening experience. The other location, Udlow Creek, had a strong focus on the sounds beneath the surface of the creek and how these sounds can actually give us information about the health of the environment. And we finished with a sonic expedition to Old Woman Island, which is just off the coast of Mooloolaba. Lyndon there swimming across to the island. And this had a very strong focus on the reefs around the island as well. So hydrophone recordings. This was a time during the migration season for humpback whales, so you can actually hear the humpback whales in the live stream as well. And so if you wanted to have a listen to the documentation of those performances, you can visit that site there, Listening in the Wild. And just to close, you know, for me, although these projects are very interdisciplinary, it's experimental sound art, it's new science and really exploring what's possible at the intersection of art and science, it's been critical for me to make sure these projects are as accessible and engaging for young people as possible. So I always make sure there's pathways for young people to engage. And I'm not going to play this example right now, but the majority of the work that I'm engaged with at the moment is really about drawing that activism attention to what's happening in these ecosystems that we don't have access to. So I'm really interested right now in shifting some of this idea of acoustic monitoring from a scientific perspective and some of the engagement work from an artistic perspective to actually regeneration. So we're investing a lot of time in exploring the possibilities of acoustics as a regeneration tool and looking at ways that this can really contribute to the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which kicks off next year in 2021. Thank you very much. I will stop screen sharing there, and I think we've got a couple of minutes for questions.
Well, thank you so much, Leah, for a very inspiring talk. Well, perhaps we explain a little bit about the context of the Q&A. You can either text a question in or unmute and ask live. So we always like to see people's faces. So we prefer the second one, if the second option, if you do have a question. We already have one via the text function, which is in the river recording timeline where we have the different rivers recorded. Someone asked the question, what is the green in the spectrum?
Oh, the green on the false color spectrograms, that was drumfish. So there were choruses of drumfish, particularly at dawn and dusk through those ribbon spectrograms.
Thank you.
No problem.
I have a question. Can you hear
Sure.
me?
Yeah.
Okay. So first, that was an amazing lecture, and the work you're doing is very inspiring. So my question is, suppose we are doing this deep listening thing, field recording for down the line 10 years and 20 years, because this is going to continue. But the sound technology is continuously evolving. So what are your views on how technology changes the sonic image of something that was captured like 10 years ago? How technology changes our listening, the environment?
Look, that's a great question, and it's a big challenge in a lot of this work, because of course when we're looking at some of these algorithms that can analyze changes in an ecosystem over 10 or 20 years, many of those recordings have been done with different microphones, different recorders, different sample rates, and so it's complicated to be able to look at having that baseline data that's all recorded in exactly the same way. Because as far as and we don't necessarily want it recorded in the same way, but as far as ecoacoustics goes, particularly in aquatic environments, there's not standardized approaches as yet. So I think, we're getting to a point now where there's more and more research projects and organizations starting to share a more standardized approach for recording different environments and ensuring that we're capturing quality recordings. There's a lot of focus in some of the ecoacoustics and bioacoustics work when we're talking about recording huge amounts of acoustic data that we might be recording at a much lower sample rate and compressing the recordings, where when we do that, obviously we're losing so much of what's actually happening in that ecosystem. So I think, we're going to see in the next couple of years, more standardized approaches, and hopefully, I would like to see more collaboration and knowledge sharing between these organizations that are really driving this field. And I think there's a really exciting role, for artists to play in, really providing those different perspectives on what actually happens when we do change those recording approaches quite dramatically, what we're losing in some of those recordings and what we obviously can gain when we're approaching those recordings in a much more holistic way, particularly when we're talking about things like ultrasonics and infrasonics in different ecosystems. So yes, I could talk about that question for happily hours, but that's actually something we're going to be covering in the workshop later as well, and looking at some of the different techniques that are available and looking at, I guess, when we're approaching technology, it's about what ecological question we're sort of asking. If it's for the purpose of recording for a creative project, then obviously we want the best quality recordings possible. But when we're recording for scientific purposes, it's about what that environmental or ecological question actually is. Hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you. And we have another question on the text. I'll just read it. It's from David Harris. Birders have very strong connections to avian life through their calls, often developed over years. Do you feel you have developed those kinds of personal connections to aquatic species through continued connection? Do you still feel the surprise and joy of hearing unexpected fish calls? Do you have a favorite sounding species?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. I mean, as I work quite a lot in terrestrial environments as well, I mean, I think I've got, I do have those connections to different terrestrial sounds, but I think for me, I am still constantly enthralled by aquatic soundscapes, and I'm always excited to record fish, because we've certainly had plenty of examples where there's fish happily swimming around the hydrophones and they're not making any sound at all. So yeah, absolutely. I feel like I've definitely developed, quite an affinity to particularly freshwater soundscapes. And I definitely still have the same, joy recording in the field, and which is why so much of my practice is very much about in situ recording and listening, as opposed to, installing devices and leaving them there. So, and do I have a favorite sounding species? I mean, that's like asking what my favorite song is, really. So I do have quite a strong affinity still to, the sounds of whales and dolphins. I mean, I always sort of swore that I'd never be that composer that became obsessed with humpback whale song, and then I became obsessed with humpback whale song. So that's definitely, still quite always a profound recording experience in the field. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Do we have any more questions, either in the text or anyone want to unmute and ask? Oh, here we have a couple. Let me grab the phone. Big question. All right, this is from Benjamin Gale. As the world starts to take the climate crisis seriously, this feels like a period where influence on society could really be possible. But how do we start to bridge the gap from art to science to government action? Wow, that's it. That is a big question.
A very big question. I mean, obviously there would be multiple ways to answer this, and I think everyone in the room would probably answer it in a very different way. But I truly think it's that, that interdisciplinary and collaborative framework. We're seeing more and more evidence of, not science projects that are looking at art as a tool to communicate outcomes, but genuine interdisciplinary collaborations where there's an equal balance between artistic and scientific perspectives. And, at the end of the day, when we're talking about the climate crisis, we're all trying to do the same thing, really. So I think the more opportunities to work together and the more pathways we can create for, community embedded action that can ripple up to governments, and the more interdisciplinary we can be in our approaches to this, the more potential there is for impact. But I think we're at the point now where there are shifts happening, but obviously it's becoming more and more urgent. And I think, there's multiple answers and multiple ways that we really need to approach this. Yeah.
Helen Walter asked, any recommendations of artists or artwork? I suppose she's asking in relation to your field.
Look, there's, I guess specifically working in the aquatic space. There's so many amazing composers and sound artists out there now doing incredible things with hydrophone recordings. Anaya Lockwood's incredible work, Chris Watson, Jana Winderen. I was actually listening to David, who I can see, who's got a camera on now, your new album of hydrophone work. I was listening to that just last night, actually, which is really incredible work as well. So I think there's some remarkable sound artists working in that ecological sound space at the moment, and many of them which are a part, I guess, broadly in the working in response to environmental themes part of this conference as well, of course. So it's I think it's a really interesting field, that we're seeing more scientists shift into the creative space and more artists become much more environmentally engaged with their practice. So there seems to be, a really strong emergence of this kind of creative work at the moment. But I'd be happy to share, a list of artists as well, if that's of interest.
So I have a question. Can you see me? I'm Roselle.
Yes.
First of all, I want to thank you personally because your work on acoustic ecology is very much a central idea to what we did in the radio program that I curated with the indigenous peoples in the midst of the lockdown in the Philippines, in the heart of the Sierra Madre Mountains. So that was a great idea. But during the time also, there were hard curatorial questions and decisions that I had to make, as I am actually curating that from the Dharawal country here in Australia. So I guess the question is, in relation to deep immersive relationship with communities like that, how do you actually navigate curatorial or artistic decisions in deciding, for example, an iteration of these long-term projects that are dynamic and it's not going to end in one project and that. So it's that kind of a.
Yeah, great question. And look, it's a challenge with every project in some ways. I think it's been very much for me about being, flexible and adaptable to what the community really wants to do. So, when the BIOSPHERE Soundscapes project was sort of launched, I had all of these frameworks for engagement and these different ways that the residencies and the labs would work. But because every community had, different questions they wanted to ask and different ways they wanted to engage with the project, it just never really felt right to try and implement these kind of frameworks. So it's always been about, being really responsive to what the community wants to do. And for me, I guess initially having an invitation or permission from First Nations communities to engage with those locations and to be guided by the location itself, to be guided by country and how we're approaching the recording and how we're getting permission for the recording. But then in terms of the creative outcomes, I mean, obviously I'm always really interested in, you know, I guess first and foremost, what the communities want to get out of the projects. And so the curatorial approach to that has been, I guess, incredibly sort of flexible and responsive in, well, is it going to be a whole bunch of recordings on a sound map, or is it going to be the live stream or an installation which is sort of just for that community in a site-specific context? And I mean, I guess the sort of slight risk for me more recently, and particularly during this year with so many changes to these research projects with COVID, has just been the kind of scale and scope of these sort of projects where they grow and grow and grow, because like you say, you know, these projects don't end, and I don't want them to end. But when obviously the communities are going through, which many of the communities we're working with at the moment are obviously, you know, struggling quite significantly. So how do you actually kind of balance the project so it's still of, you know, value and hopefully contributing to the community in a way that, the project itself is still, I guess, I mean, that's a hard one to describe, but yeah, I guess it's just finding that balance between the scale and the scope of the work itself, and making sure it's always positioned in a way that, not making compromises for, how it's being presented creatively, that, the site and the community is always priority. I went on a bit of a tangent at the end there, but hopefully it still made sense.
I call it fluid methodology, the way I do curatorial, actually.
Yes. Excellent. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, coincidentally, straight after at 5 o'clock Hong Kong time, we're actually hearing from a Hong Kong curator, Si Ka Yan, about, you know, touching upon some of the elements you just mentioned about, you know, the challenges of curatorial direction, working in different communities, particularly related to these issues of being relevant to the struggles during, you know, pandemic times. You know, a lot of you know, different elements of how to put on a production within a local context, related to, you know, remote communities and the environment. So unfortunately that talk is only in Cantonese, but that is at 5 o'clock Hong Kong time. Just wondering if we have any more questions from our audience. No, nothing in text. No. Well, thank you so much, Leah. Well, actually, I have one question. It's sort of a come around since we did this. Initially was sort of part of a program we talked about, I mean, a year and a half ago or something. Initially, we're going to have you come to Hong Kong, work with our, you know, communities here. We're talking about possibly a river listening project. I mean, that evolved in maybe something more digital. And now with the restrictions that have come up sort of in this form. But we did, you know, before the lockdown this week in Hong Kong, last week we were able to stage a concert, which was called, it was part of a showcase called the Insect Concerto, which actually was by a German composer, Gregor Mayhofer, talking about the worldwide decline of insect populations. And I was quite intrigued, sort of listening to some of the aquatic insects, and sort of, you know, just as a side note, you know, maybe just to sort of contextualize this piece within, you know, the wider series framework, you know, like what, as a commentary on, you know, the worldwide decline of certain populations of well, they could be insects or whales or whatever, you know, what do you see as your role in this process? Last week, the composer's role was, you know, it was a collaboration with the World Wildlife Fund. It was a fundraising effort. But for yourself as a researcher and an artist, as an interdisciplinary collaborator, what is your changing role through this process?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess it shifts and adapts project to project in a way. I mean, I guess my role is always sort of first and foremost as a sound artist and composer in these collaborations as a field recordist. But I guess when we're talking specifically about biodiversity loss or extinction, I mean, I feel like there's that urgency to bring these soundscapes directly to listeners. So for people to have that embodied connection with these environments and with these species that are at risk, I feel that, if we can create these immersive environments that allow people to feel present and connected, particularly when we're talking about ecosystems that we don't traditionally have access to, I feel that is that is absolutely what I feel my role is in these projects. But I think it's also that role of kind of, facilitator and researcher in really being able to bring artists and scientists together and make sure the work is kind of really embedded in communities as well, and as much as possible trying to get it into the hands of decision makers too. So looking at how these creative tools like the mobile applications, can really be used in a decision making context too.
Yeah, so these mobile apps and the technology you mentioned, perhaps this is a good segue. If we have no more questions, feel free to voice out if you do. But perhaps this is a good segue into the workshop, which we'll have in roughly an hour to allow you some time for dinner, Australia time, and a little break. But maybe you could explain a little bit about what we can expect in your workshop.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I'm going to keep the workshop a lot more interactive. I mean, basically, I'll be introducing some of the different types of technologies that we're using in these projects for both artistic and scientific purposes. I mean, touching on one of those questions before around looking at, I guess, why we're recording and how we're recording, and keeping that, I guess, much more interactive in a Q&A sort of sense. I'll be showing some of the technology and demoing it. And then also talking about some of the mobile applications and the possibilities of that. And I think we said we'd sort of close, but with more of a conversation around, where this work is going and the potential too.
Fantastic. Thank you.